Part 1. Pickles. In Chapter 1, Hadrian Blackwater is immediately robbed upon disembarking from a ship in the chaotic port of Vernes. After unsuccessfully chasing the thief, he encounters a scrappy young boy named Pickles, who claims to have protected Hadrian's stolen bag. Despite Hadrian's protests, Pickles insists on guiding him to a barge traveling up the Burnham River. However, the situation quickly escalates when press gang thugs appear attempting to capture the boy. Hadrian intervenes, using his combat skills to subdue the thugs, and decides to leave with Pickles, still unsure of the boy's motives but grateful for his help. In Chapter 2, Hadrian and Pickles navigate through the crowded, grimy streets of Vernes, with Pickles guiding Hadrian toward a barge for passage north. Hadrian reflects on his past and the scent of blood that lingers on him. When they encounter a group of soldiers, Hadrian is questioned but clears up any suspicions. The officer, however, prevents Pickles from joining Hadrian on the journey, fearing he may know something about recent murders. Hadrian offers Pickles money and a job in Sheridan, instructing him to meet him there. Hadrian boards the barge, leaving the boy behind. Part 2. Gwen. In Chapter 1, Gwen rushes to stop Stain from killing Avon, hearing her screams from the second floor of the Hideous Head Tavern. Gwen tries to break down the door, but is interrupted by Gru. After a violent confrontation, Gwen learns Avon is dead. Gwen confronts Gru and Stain, seeking justice, but Gru settles for a monetary compensation instead of punishment. Gwen, furious and distraught, races to the sheriff's office, but Ethan accepts Gru's terms. Stain taunts Gwen, making threats before she flees. In the alley, Gwen collapses in despair, feeling helpless against the violent world around her. Part 3. The Burnham River Barge. In Chapter 1, Hadrian travels on a river barge to the town of Culnora, feeling out of place in a strange land. He meets Sebastian, a merchant from Iber, and his two companions, Samuel and Eugene. They discuss rumors of murders in Vernes, and Sebastian suggests a cloaked figure on the boat might be the killer. Hadrian, suspicious of the group's conclusions, talks to the man, who coldly dismisses him. The group debates how to handle the potential threat, with some suggesting they tie up the hooded man, but Hadrian refuses to go along with their plan, remaining wary of their fear-driven actions. In Chapter 2, the group gathers for lunch on the barge. Hadrian learns that Sebastian runs the most prestigious jewelry store in Vernes, and that the others are involved in the business. Sebastian reveals his rivalry with his cousin Samuel, whom he helped start his own shop. Vivian, who has been quiet, grows upset when asked about her reasons for traveling. She leaves to sit at the bow, and Sebastian suggests she's distressed due to some past trauma. Hadrian, feeling awkward and guilty, struggles to offer comfort, while Vivian quietly wipes away tears, deep in her own thoughts. In Chapter 3, the group continues their journey as Farland sleeps and the young steersman takes over. Vivian remains distant, retreating to her cabin, while Hadrian spends the day sharpening his sword. After sunset, he offers Vivian his cloak to comfort her, apologizing for earlier. She reveals her husband's recent murder and the fear that someone is pursuing her for something he sought. She believes the hooded man on board is the killer. Hadrian reassures her, promising to alert the sheriff upon arrival in Culnora, but Vivian fears she may not survive the journey. Hadrian offers advice to protect herself. Part 4. The Hideous Head. In Chapter 1, Gwen, exhausted from a beating by Gru, reflects on her harsh life in Wayward Street. Despite the pain, she recalls her mother's dream of reaching Medford, a city Gwen has never seen. Raised with the gift of fortune-telling, Gwen was trained by her mother, but many unanswered questions lingered. After her mother's death, Gwen was left destitute and alone, except for a mysterious man who paid her mother's debt with strange coins and gave her a cryptic prophecy about Medford. Gwen now guards the coins, hoping for answers as she struggles to survive. In Chapter 2, Gwen discusses with Gru about Stain's recent activities and his plans. Stain has paid his debt and is repairing the door, which leads Gwen to worry about his intentions. Gru dismisses her fears, claiming Stain is not a killer, but Gwen remains fearful. She warns that Stain will kill Jalin out of revenge, but Gru insists he won't. Gwen realizes they cannot survive alone and plans to escape with the other girls. After gathering her savings, she urges them to leave, promising they'll have a better chance together. They prepare to flee, despite Gru's threats. Part 5. Murder on the Burnham. In Chapter 1, Hadrian awakens late. prompting concern from his companions. The group, including Sebastian, Eugene, Samuel, Vivian, and a mysterious hooded man, continues their journey along the river. The landscape shifts dramatically as they approach northern terrain. When Hadrian questions the whereabouts of the steersman, Farlan, the group discovers he is missing. After searching the area and receiving unsettling news about the river's dangerous currents, they are left without a steersman. The merchants decide to steer the barge themselves, with Eugene tasked to begin the navigation, despite the looming challenges ahead. In Chapter 2, the group continues their journey with Eugene at the tiller, though he struggles with the task. Hadrian learns of suspicions regarding Farlan's disappearance, with Samuel accusing the hooded man of murder. While the others believe Farlan was killed to stop an investigation, Hadrian remains unconvinced, arguing there's not enough evidence. Tensions rise as Samuel pushes for immediate action, suggesting they kill the hooded man. Hadrian refuses, advocating for waiting until they reach Colnora and letting the law investigate. The group remains divided, with Hadrian determined to protect both Vivian and the hooded man until more is known. In Chapter 3, Hadrian reflects on his journey and the narrowing river as the group continues their way to Colnora. After a quiet day, Vivian asks him to stay the night in her room for safety, fearing the hooded man. Hadrian agrees, but remains cautious, offering to sit by the door to guard her. Vivian's intentions become unclear as she begins undressing, leading Hadrian to suspect something isn't right. Just as the tension rises, screams echo through the boat, interrupting their conversation and signaling an imminent danger that could be the result of the hooded man's actions. In Chapter 4, Hadrian discovers the aftermath of a brutal massacre on the barge. He finds Samuel and the two merchants dead, their throats cut. Vivian is also killed in her cabin. The barge is stationary, and Andrew, the postilion, is missing with signs of a struggle. Hadrian searches the hold, but finds no clues. Realizing the danger is not over, he secures the barge and leaves on horseback, with the horses as his only company. As he rides away, he contemplates the possibility of encountering the hooded man again, determined to bring him to justice. Part 6. The Ruins of Wayward. In Chapter 1, Gwen reflects on her difficult life in Medford, escaping Gru's control after discovering his true nature. Struggling with poverty, she considers using her 4 gold coins to escape, but realizes survival in Medford means more than just leaving. Gwen and her companions, including Rose, Jolin, and Abby, find temporary shelter in the ruins of the Hideous Head Tavern. As they search for warmth and food, Gwen makes a bold decision to establish a business despite the obstacles ahead. She plans to gather information in the merchant quarter and take control of her destiny, refusing to return to Gru's grip. In Chapter 2, Gwen and her companions venture into the bustling merchant quarter of Medford, hoping to buy supplies. Gwen faces rejection at a shop, but Jolin steps in and haggles successfully. After purchasing blankets, they learn they need a royal writ to open a business, which requires a trip to the expensive Gentry Square. Jolin shares that the writ's cost depends on the business type, leaving the group concerned about their limited funds. Undeterred, Gwen refuses to give up and suggests returning to the inn, questioning if there are laws against 7 girls simply eating bread and cheese in an abandoned building. In Chapter 3, Gwen and her group return to their dilapidated building after a long day. They struggle to start a fire due to a blocked chimney and settle for eating in the dark. As they huddle together, Gwen reflects on the challenges they face, including the need for a business permit. Jolene expresses concern about their funds, but Gwen reassures her. The group discusses the building's eerie history, with rumors of the owner murdering his wife. The chapter ends with Gwen, amused by Rose's comment, considering the possibility of revenge against their oppressive employer, Gru. Part 7. Colnora. In Chapter 1, Hadrian arrives in Colnora after a long journey and reports a series of murders to Sheriff Mallet. He explains that he survived a massacre on a barge, where everyone else was killed by a man in a dark cloak. Mallet is skeptical, questioning Hadrian's story and motivations. Despite the gruesome nature of the crime, Mallet is uninterested in investigating immediately, opting to wait until morning. Hadrian reveals he's heading to Sheridan to visit a family friend following his father's death. Mallet connects the killings to a notorious past murderer called Duster, raising further suspicion. In Chapter 2, Hadrian and Sheriff Mallet investigate the site where the barge was supposed to be. However, the barge is missing, and there are no signs of the crew or any evidence to confirm Hadrian's story. They visit the shipping dock where the owner, Bennett, denies any knowledge of the barge or its crew. Hadrian is frustrated and begins to question his own sanity, especially when the sheriff dismisses his concerns. The sheriff suggests Hadrian should continue his journey to Sheridan, hinting that his story is becoming more of a nuisance than a case. Part 8. Medford House. In Chapter 1, Gwen and Rose, soaked by rain, visit the city assessor to secure a permit for a building on Wayward Street. They are hoping to buy the dilapidated property and start a business. After a tense meeting, the assessor explains that all land is owned by the king and grants only a certificate of royal permit for specific businesses. Gwen opts to open a brothel and pays the required fees. While relieved to have a place to start, she is warned that the certificate can be revoked at any time, leaving her both hopeful and anxious about their future. In Chapter 2, Gwen and Rose return to the dilapidated building they've secured and discuss their plans to fix it up. The structure is in disrepair, and the group is uncertain about how to proceed without help. Gwen realizes they'll need strong labor to move heavy beams and clear debris. She recruits Dixon, a local man, offering him food and a job to assist with the renovations. Despite the dire conditions, Gwen remains determined, and they begin the work needed to transform the building into a brothel, which Rose whimsically names Medford House. In Chapter 3, Gwen and Dixon visit the riverside docks to find Henry the Fisher, where they encounter a bustling tavern, the Three Sheets, and the nearby fishery. Gwen is focused on establishing Medford House and realizes she must attract clients from outside the lower quarter. After a tense confrontation with Stain, a man from her past, Dixon intervenes. They later visit Artisan Row, where Gwen hires a carpenter to begin work on her new house. Though the initial payment is small, she intends to expand the property gradually as Medford House grows. Part 9. The Professor. In Chapter 1, Hadrian spends 5 days in Colnora searching for a hooded figure but finding only memories of Vivian. When the rain stops, he heads north, trading his old horse for a new one and adjusting to the weather. After 2 days of travel, he enters a forest and feels a strange presence but sees nothing. He then encounters a man in the village of Wyndham who provides directions to Sheridan. Hadrian learns that the road ahead leads to Medford and the Meadowlands, where the school he seeks might be. He continues his journey, reflecting on the strange events around him. In Chapter 2, Hadrian arrives at a university to meet Professor Arcadius, guided by a letter from his late father. As he navigates the impressive campus, he encounters students and is led to Arcadius's office by Bartholomew. Inside, the cluttered room is filled with books and oddities. Arcadius explains how he found Hadrian using magic and gives him a medallion that belonged to his father, a cherished family heirloom. Arcadius shares that his father wanted him to keep the medallion and pass it on to his son. Afterward, Bartholomew is tasked with providing Hadrian a meal and a place to stay. In Chapter 3, Hadrian reunites with Pickles, a boy he met in the past, and they catch up as they explore a new place. Pickles eagerly shows Hadrian the dormitory, marveling at the cleanliness of the environment. Pickles then offers to take care of Hadrian's horse and mentions his task of returning a book to the library. At the library, they discuss swords, with Pickles impressed by Hadrian's skill and craftsmanship. As they prepare to leave, Hadrian notices a mysterious figure in a hooded cloak watching him from a window. He briefly questions it, but chooses to move on. In Chapter 4, Hadrian and Pickles enter Glen Hall, where Hadrian insists Pickles accompany him to the dining hall despite the boy's reluctance. Inside, Hadrian grows distracted, thinking about the mysterious hooded figure he saw earlier. At dinner, they encounter Angdon, the Baron's son, who mocks Pickles and Hadrian. In a fit of frustration, Pickles throws his pie into Angdon's face, prompting Hadrian to quickly escort him out. As they leave, Hadrian reminds Pickles of his role to watch, not fight. Pickles responds that his friendship with Hadrian is more valuable than any noble's. Part 10. The Hooded Man. In Chapter 1, Hadrian spends the night in Vincent Quinn's bed, reflecting on his life as a soldier, feeling like a tool with no purpose. The barracks is filled with boys, including Pickles, who is also ignored by the others, but draws some attention. Despite the whispers about meat pies, Hadrian feels somewhat more comfortable than on the cold ground, though the mattress is hard. He eventually falls asleep, troubled by the lack of direction in his life. In Chapter 2, Hadrian wakes up in the middle of the night, disturbed by a nightmare, and finds himself uneasy about the hooded figure he saw in the window. Unable to sleep, he dresses and leaves the dormitory, moving silently through the dimly lit halls of Glen Hall. His suspicions about the hooded man drive him to investigate the third-floor room where he had seen the figure. Finding the small storage room, he peers out of the window, recalling the peaceful scene outside, but his unease lingers. He wonders if the killer might still be stalking him. In Chapter 3, Hadrian explores the confusing corridors of Glen Hall and eventually finds the meal hall. There he meets Professor Arcadius, who engages him in conversation about life, learning, and his past experiences. Hadrian opens up about his military history and his struggles with violence, revealing the impact of his father's teachings on him. The professor listens and asks about Hadrian's plans, but the conversation shifts when Hadrian mentions a mysterious figure in a hood, possibly linked to a series of murders he witnessed. Arcadius leads him to his office, where the hooded man is waiting. In Chapter 4, Hadrian confronts Royce, the man he believes killed everyone on the barge. However, Royce reveals he killed to protect Hadrian from the killers, including Vivian, who murdered the boatman. Despite his brutal actions, Royce claims it was all to prevent further bloodshed. Arcadius, the professor, then reveals his plan to make Hadrian and Royce partners, urging them to work together on a mission to steal a journal from the Patriarch's tower. Reluctantly, Hadrian agrees to help, although he remains skeptical of both Royce and the task, unsure of what lies ahead. In Chapter 5, Hadrian reflects on the loss of his childhood dreams, shaped by his father's death and the harsh realities of war. He meets with Arcadius, who hints at his father's true intentions involving Royce Melborn, a troubled man with a dark past. Arcadius explains Royce's complex nature, urging Hadrian to work with him both for personal growth and survival. The professor offers Hadrian a chance to redeem his father's legacy, proposing a mission in exchange for settling his father's affairs. Hadrian insists that Pickles, a companion, be allowed an education in return for accepting the task. Part 11. Training. In Chapter 1, Hadrian struggles to climb a wall, constantly failing and facing harsh criticism from Royce. Despite his frustration, Hadrian learns to read body language and begins to understand Royce's exceptional skills. After several failed attempts, Royce becomes increasingly annoyed, while Arcadius, the professor, insists on involving Hadrian in the mission to retrieve a book from a tower. Royce protests, but the professor stands firm. As tensions rise, Hadrian questions his usefulness, but Arcadius advises that growth comes from challenges, comparing it to forging a sword, difficult, painful, and necessary for strength. In Chapter 2, Hadrian's ankle heals while he spends his time outdoors, reflecting on a statue of Glenmorgan I. Pickles approaches, bruised from a fight with Angdon and his friends, and reveals his desire to learn to read to better his future. Hadrian offers to teach him fighting skills, but Pickles wants to learn reading to eventually outshine his noble enemies through intellect and wealth. Hadrian promises to help him, revealing that Professor Arcadius will ensure Pickles receives a top-tier education at the university. Hadrian, unsure of his own task, prepares to leave soon for an unknown mission. In Chapter 3, Hadrian, feeling better after his injury, goes in search of Royce. He is interrupted by a student who informs him that Pickles needs him in the stable. Upon arrival, Hadrian finds Angdon and his friends waiting to confront him. Angdon taunts Hadrian with a mock lesson in respect, wielding an axe. However, before the fight can escalate, a mysterious figure in a black cloak appears behind Angdon, causing him to collapse, wounded. The cloaked figure, revealed to be Royce, silently leaves after the confrontation, leaving Hadrian stunned and confused. In Chapter 4, Royce faces off with Professor Arcadius, who is frustrated by Royce's violent tendencies, especially after Royce injures a student, Angdon. Royce defends his actions, claiming he protected Hadrian from a trap set by the other students. Royce suspects Arcadius has ulterior motives for pairing him with Hadrian, hinting at a wager or contest. Arcadius insists this isn't a game, but warns them that Angdon's injury will lead to repercussions, and they must leave to avoid arrest. Royce orders Hadrian to prepare for their departure, warning that he's only leading him to his death. Part 12. Rainer Gru. In Chapter 1, Gru, the self-proclaimed ruler of Wayward Street, watches Gwen and her workers from his alehouse as they build a new brothel across the street. Frustrated by her independence, he confronts her, reminding her of her past under his control and demanding she return with the other women. Gwen, however, stands her ground, asserting her freedom and her intent never to return. Gru's attempt to intimidate her fails when Dixon the Carter intervenes, forcefully defending Gwen. Gru leaves, humiliated but vowing revenge, hinting that he won't let Gwen's defiance go unanswered. In Chapter 2, Gru, nursing his bruised ego and body after his fall, awaits a meeting with Reginald Lampwick, the local inspector. Gru is frustrated by Gwen's new brothel across the street, which threatens his business by attracting clients away from his tavern. To counter this, he proposes a bribe to Reginald. If the inspector delays the approval of Gwen's application and rejects it at the last minute, Gru will reapply and split the profits. The chapter ends with Reginald subtly signaling his willingness to consider Gru's offer, setting up a potential alliance. Part 13. Iberton. In Chapter 1, Hadrian and Royce travel through the bleak landscape of Ghent, a windswept barren highland ruled by the Nifron Church. Hadrian reflects on his conflicted past and discomfort with the theft they are about to commit, though he justifies it as a possible chance to help his friend, Pickles. As they ride in tense silence, Hadrian wonders why Arcadius paired him with Royce, a man who shows no friendship or loyalty. When they finally stop to camp, their few exchanges are bitter and defensive, highlighting their mutual distrust and deep ideological differences. In Chapter 1, Hadrian and Royce continue their silent journey toward the Crown Tower, a distant ruin that grows more imposing as they travel. Hadrian reflects on the tension between them, softened only by a brief, light-hearted exchange about waterproofing canvas for camping. Royce's reluctance to accept Hadrian's help underscores their uneasy partnership. As they near the tower, Hadrian observes its massive structure, imagining the battles that once took place around it. Royce's reaction to the tower's name, Crown Tower, suggests a shared understanding, but they remain distant as they press on toward their goal. In Chapter 2, Hadrian and Royce arrive in the quaint village of Iberton. They stop at a tavern where Hadrian engages in friendly conversation with the locals, including Lord Marbury, a former noble now living quietly. Marbury explains the village's focus on barley farming and its renowned ale. Royce, meanwhile, is tense and wary, noticing 5 armed men on the road behind them. He suspects they're being hunted, possibly due to a recent altercation involving a baron's son. Royce urges Hadrian to stay vigilant, warning him that they may need to defend themselves and eliminate witnesses if their pursuers arrive. In Chapter 3, 5 men in chainmail enter the tavern, their leader displaying the crest of a broken crown and revealing themselves as Serret Knights. They question Dugan about 2 men wanted for stabbing a noble's son. Tension escalates as they scrutinize Hadrian, who claims to be a smith and Marbury's guest. Marbury deflects suspicion with a fabricated story about Hadrian building a copper tub, while Royce waits outside for a possible ambush. After the Serret leave, Hadrian checks for Royce, only to find his companion has departed, leaving Hadrian to ponder Royce's clever escape. Part 14. Back to school. In Chapter 1, Hadrian wakes up to find Royce still missing, causing him frustration and worry. After waiting in vain for Royce at the tavern, Hadrian starts his journey back to Sheridan alone, wrestling with anger and disappointment over Royce's abandonment. Upon his return, Hadrian encounters Royce at Arcadius's office, where it's revealed that Royce failed to follow Arcadius's instructions by not taking Hadrian up the tower. To settle their debt, Arcadius orders them to return the stolen book together, with Hadrian leading the mission this time. Royce reluctantly agrees, but tensions between the two remain high, promising further conflict ahead. In Chapter 2, Hadrian and Royce successfully climb to the roof of Glen Hall using harnesses and ropes. Hadrian carries a book for Royce, and though Royce criticizes his weapons, Hadrian insists on being prepared. They discuss the view from the top, with Royce reflecting on how the world looks simpler from a height. After Royce drops down swiftly, Hadrian hesitates but eventually follows, learning to trust the ropes despite his fear. As he gains confidence, he begins to enjoy the experience, realizing he can handle the task and even looks forward to doing it again. In Chapter 3, Royce and Hadrian are confined to their room for safety after Angdon Lerwick's stabbing. They rest, then meet with Arcadius, who reveals troubling news about Pickles. The professor explains that Pickles was falsely accused of attempting to kill Angdon and was executed for conspiracy. Hadrian is furious and devastated, questioning Arcadius's role, but the professor clarifies he couldn't intervene due to the church's control. Despite the pain, Hadrian decides to finish the mission with Royce honoring his agreement. Arcadius expresses hope for their future, while Hadrian struggles with grief and anger over Pickles' death. Part 15. Assessing the future. In Chapter 1, Gwen proudly shows Inspector Reginald around the newly renovated building at the end of Wayward Street, which she plans to turn into a successful brothel. Despite its unfinished interior, the establishment draws attention for its quality and unique services. Gwen explains that the women working there have control over their lives and are motivated to please clients, creating a loyal customer base. However, the inspector refuses to approve the certificate, citing concerns about her business's potential influence and the threat it poses to traditional norms. Gwen pleads for a change of heart, but he remains unmoved. In Chapter 2, Gwen and Rose visit the city assessor to secure the necessary certificate for Gwen's brothel. The assessor reveals that the inspector will reject her application due to a deal with Rainer Grew. Gwen proposes a bribe, offering a quarter of the brothel's profits to the assessor in exchange for his support. She argues that Grew will fail to make the business a success and that she alone can grow it. After a tense negotiation, the assessor agrees to her deal, securing the certificate and setting the stage for further success, much to the dismay of the inspector. In Chapter 3, Gwen reflects on her actions, feeling conflicted about her recent success in saving the house at the cost of selling the gold coins. She questions whether it was worth it, fearing that she may have lost something essential. Dixon joins her outside, and their conversation reveals mutual affection, though Gwen remains unsure of her feelings. Gwen shares that she has the ability to read palms and foretells Dixon's future, discovering troubling details. She urges him to buy a new horse and deliver a load of lumber, instructing him to bring 2 injured men back if he finds them. Part 16. The Crown Tower. In Chapter 1, Hadrian and Royce approach the Crown Tower, with Hadrian reflecting on the death of Pickles, a boy executed due to Royce's actions. Royce remains indifferent to Pickles' fate, dismissing Hadrian's anger and focusing on their mission. As they prepare for their climb, Royce explains the harsh challenges ahead, including a dangerous ascent and potential death. Despite Royce's cold attitude and apparent lack of remorse, Hadrian is determined to complete their task and seek vengeance, vowing to return the book and confront Royce. Tensions rise as the two prepare for the difficult climb. In Chapter 2, Royce and Hadrian navigate the narrow, maze-like streets of Ervenon, a city of stone buildings clustered around the towering Crown Tower. As they make their way through the alleys, Hadrian struggles to keep up, increasingly frustrated with Royce's seemingly effortless movements. After a tense climb up the tower, Hadrian grapples with his anger and self-doubt, reflecting on his past and questioning his reasons for living. The climb becomes a test of endurance, with Hadrian pushing through exhaustion and fear. Eventually, he catches up with Royce, determined not to let him succeed at his expense. Part 17. Royce. In Chapter 1, Royce reflects on the changes since his last visit to the Crown Tower. His mission, once simple, is now complicated by the presence of Hadrian, whose incompetence complicates Royce's plans. Despite his preparations and understanding of the tower's layout, Royce is distracted by new challenges, including the presence of soldiers hunting him and a nagging uncertainty about his former mentor, Arcadius's motives. Royce's thoughts turn to his past, particularly his betrayal by Merrick, who had once been like a brother. As Royce and Hadrian infiltrate the tower, they are interrupted by a priest, signaling that things are far from simple. In Chapter 2, after Royce cuts off the priest's scream, he orders Hadrian to drop the book and escape. Royce disappears quickly, leaving Hadrian behind to deal with the chaos. Alone on the tower, Hadrian rushes toward the rope, realizing he's being pursued by guards. He struggles with the harness, questioning why there are 2. As he prepares to descend, he realizes Royce must have gone the opposite way, leaving him to fend for himself. With guards closing in and time running out, Hadrian is forced to act quickly, knowing that if the rope is cut, his escape will be impossible. In Chapter 3, Royce faces a group of tower guards, realizing survival is possible only with 2 remaining. As he fights off several men, he's shocked when Hadrian, who was supposed to be escaping, reappears and joins the battle, killing most of the guards. The 2 make a dash for the rope, but are blocked by strange armored guards wielding halberds. After a fierce fight, Hadrian saves Royce from a deadly blow, but both are badly injured. As they lay on the tower, Royce, near death, asks why Hadrian returned to help. Hadrian's answer, "Same reason I'm not leaving you here." In Chapter 4, Royce and Hadrian escape the tower using a rope, with Royce still badly injured. As they drop from the tower, Royce complains about the pain while Hadrian remains focused on getting them to safety. They decide to head toward the river to avoid the blood trail, despite Royce's doubts about surviving the jump. They find a box in an alley and use it for support before Hadrian leads them to a wall overlooking the river. With horns and bells signaling danger, they prepare to jump, agreeing that if one dies, the other will too. They leap together. Part 18. Rose. In Chapter 1, Rose watches Gwen stand firm against a rough customer, Hopper demanding a woman without bathing. Gwen insists on cleanliness and respect, offering him the option to clean up before returning. After he leaves, Gwen discusses plans to improve the house and treat customers better, including offering bathing services. Later, Stain, a threatening figure, arrives with ill intentions, but Gwen shocks him with a chilling, prophetic description of his brutal death at the hands of an unknown killer. Terrified, Stain retreats, and Gwen, shaken by the vision, collapses in Rose's arms. In Chapter 2, Rose and Gwen sit on the porch, reminiscing about the past and discussing Gwen's mysterious abilities. Gwen reveals her sight, a gift passed down from her mother, which allows her to see the future by looking into someone's eyes. Rose opens up about her difficult past, including her father's abandonment and her mother's prideful death, which led her to Medford. They discuss Gwen's quest for a mysterious man she feels destined to help, though she doesn't know who he is. Gwen also reveals a cryptic vision of Rose falling in love, but when she sees it, the vision causes her to drop the teacup. Part 19. Flight. In Chapter 1, Royce and Hadrian float down a river after a harrowing escape, arriving at Lake Morgan. Royce, wounded and barely conscious, is helped by Hadrian as they struggle to find shelter. They spot a nearby tavern, but it's locked. After a tense moment, Dugan, the bartender, lets them in. Hadrian requests supplies, bandages, food, and dry clothes. Royce, weakened by blood loss, drifts in and out of consciousness as Dugan helps them. Royce jokes about their heist, but the pain from his injuries intensifies, and he slips into unconsciousness as Hadrian tends to him. In Chapter 2, Royce wakes in pain, recovering from his injuries with Hadrian's help. Hadrian explains the wounds aren't as bad as they seemed, though Royce is still weak. As Royce grapples with the strange bond forming between them, he wonders why Hadrian saved him. Hadrian admits he's tired of running and leaving people to die, revealing a more vulnerable side. The two discuss their situation. They can't return to Sheridan, and Royce's injuries are worsening. They decide to head southwest despite the risks. Exhausted, they camp for the night, contemplating their uncertain future. In Chapter 3, Royce and Hadrian struggle to find their bearings in the rain, surrounded by unfamiliar terrain. They are hunted by a patrol with hounds, and Royce is injured and exhausted. As they make their way across the hills, they encounter a farmhouse where the elderly farmer, Tom the Feather, and his family take them in. Despite initial resistance, the farmer provides food and shelter, understanding the importance of doing what's right over what's safe. Royce and Hadrian, on the run for a crime they didn't commit, must rely on each other as they await the approaching patrol. Part 20. Tom the Feather. In Chapter 1, Royce, Hadrian, and a family hide in a farmhouse as soldiers search for them. After an intense confrontation, Hadrian kills 2 guards, but the rest of the soldiers remain outside, ready to break in. They face a tense standoff, realizing that their only option is to fight. Tom, the farmer, reveals his past as an archer and offers his help despite the risk. Hadrian and Royce plan a desperate charge to seize the knight's horse and escape, knowing they are outnumbered and wounded. They prepare for a suicidal confrontation, with their survival hinging on luck and quick action. In Chapter 2, Hadrian and Royce launch a desperate attack on the soldiers outside. Hadrian swings first, allowing Royce to charge at the knight. Despite pain and dizziness, Royce manages to grab the knight's foot and cut the stirrup strap, causing the horse to fall. Royce clings to the knight but is struck multiple times with the pommel before the knight crashes to the ground. Royce's leg is crushed, but Hadrian pulls him free. The knight and horse are both dead, and Tom provides support with his longbow. Hadrian is struck by an arrow, but as he succumbs to his injuries, he asks, "Did we win?" In Chapter 3, Royce and Hadrian lie injured in the muddy water, unable to move. Hadrian seems unconscious, and Royce struggles to keep himself above the rising water. Tom and Arthur arrive, with Tom pulling an arrow from Hadrian and tending to his wounds. A new sound of horse hooves approaches, signaling possible reinforcements. Royce briefly reflects on their struggle and regrets not leaving Hadrian earlier. As they are lifted into a wagon, Royce resigns himself to death, but before losing consciousness, he touches Hadrian's arm and acknowledges their partnership. The rain continues, and darkness takes over. Part 21. Impenetrable. In Chapter 1, Royce awakens in pain, realizing he and Hadrian are alone in a cart in a desolate town. He struggles to sit up and assesses their situation, discovering they've been traveling for an unknown amount of time. Hadrian is still alive, but struggling to breathe. In desperation, Royce crawls to a nearby door, seeking help, but the town's inhabitants ignore him. He cries out in vain for assistance. Just as he gives up, a woman appears, comforting him and promising help. She orders the man to bring Hadrian inside, and Royce loses consciousness, trusting they'll be saved. Part 22. What's in a name? In Chapter 1, Royce awakens in pain, realizing he and Hadrian are alone in a cart in a desolate town. He struggles to sit up and assesses their situation, discovering they've been traveling for an unknown amount of time. Hadrian is still alive, but struggling to breathe. In desperation, Royce crawls to a nearby door, seeking help, but the town's inhabitants ignore him. He cries out in vain for assistance. Just as he gives up, a woman appears, comforting him and promising help. She orders the man to bring Hadrian inside, and Royce loses consciousness, trusting they'll be saved.